Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about a chapter that's barely a whisper even among the most die-hard Warhammer 40k lore fanatics. A chapter that stands so far out on the edge of Imperial awareness you could be forgiven for thinking they were a myth. Or, worse, forgotten on purpose. I'm talking about the Emperor's Spears. Not just another group of Primaris Space Marines, not just another warband tasked with holding the line. These are warriors forged for a war no one remembers, stationed on a dying world no one visits, fighting for an Imperium that barely acknowledges their existence. And yet, in a galaxy crumbling under its own weight, they might be the last ones who still understand what loyalty truly means. There's something captivating about the Emperor's Spears that makes them stand apart from every other chapter we usually hear about. It's not their armor, which bears the golden spear and the crest of a sea predator. It's not their combat style, brutal and owned from centuries of isolation. It's the fact that they're a reminder of what Space Marines were meant to be before bureaucracy, dogma, and high politics twisted the idea into something unrecognizable. They were never glory seekers, never the kind to parade in the halls of Terra. They're ghosts, watchful, dangerous, loyal in ways that make the Adeptus Administratum uncomfortable. And that's exactly why their story deserves to be told. Because here's the thing, most people don't even know they exist. And those who do, they often misunderstand them. The Spears aren't forgotten by accident. They've been pushed aside, relegated to a distant corner of the galaxy, left to rot or rise on their own terms. And yet, they still hold the line. Still fight the enemies of humanity without thanks, without backup, without even acknowledgement. The Emperor's Spears are not just another obscure chapter lost in the records. They're a quiet rebellion against the decay of the Imperium itself. If that doesn't make them worth talking about, I don't know what does. So if you've ever wondered what happens to the Space Marines who are too dangerous, too pure, or too inconvenient for the Imperium to spotlight, this story is for you. Because maybe, just maybe, the Emperor's last true loyalists aren't the ones shouting their oaths in the halls of Terra. Maybe they're the ones who were never invited there in the first place. The origins of the Emperor's Spears are unlike anything we usually hear when talking about Astartes chapters. Most of the time, we get the same familiar rhythm, created from this gene seed, founded in that era, fought in some famous campaign. But with the Spears, it's different. Their genesis isn't loud or marked by triumph. It's shrouded in murk, almost deliberately vague. What we do know is that they were one of the many chapters birthed during the Ultima founding, that massive rollout of Primaris Space Marines during the days of Roboute Guilliman's resurrection. But unlike their brother chapters, the Spears were hurled not into glory, but into abandonment. They were assigned to the Alara's Vale region, a distant, storm-racked segment of the Imperium Nihilus, where communication with Terra is practically impossible. And in that forgotten pocket of the galaxy, the Emperor's Spears became more than just a chapter. They became the guardians of a dead dream, a bulwark against the abyss. What makes it even more haunting is that no one seems to know who precisely ordered their deployment there. Was it Guilliman himself, some rogue element within the Adeptus Mechanicus? Or was it a quiet punishment from the High Lords? Banish the inconvenient warriors to the edge and hope they vanish into myth. Their homeworld, Nematon, tells you everything about their roots if you know how to look. It's not some fortress world or cathedral planet bathed in the Emperor's light. It's harsh, storm-torn, brutal. A place that breeds survivors, not saints. The planet itself doesn't even seem like it should be inhabited, let alone be the bastion of a Space Marine chapter. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the Emperor's Spears were never meant to be shining paragons. Maybe they were designed to be the iron in the blood of a galaxy already bleeding out. And their gene seed? That's another rabbit hole. Officially, they're said to come from Ultramarine stock, like so many Primaris chapters. But if you dig around, and I mean really dig, you'll find whispers that their temperament, their approach to war, and even their relationship with the wider Imperium doesn't match the Guilliman mold. Ultramarines are structured, noble, clean. The Spears? They're feral, instinctive, closer to wolves than knights. Some fans speculate that something else was added to their gene template. Something older, maybe even forbidden. There's a theory that Kahl experimented with hybridizing traits from other legions, and the Emperor's spears might be a result of one such project gone silent. Maybe that's why they were sent so far away, to hide the evidence. It's not just their biology or their exile that makes them unique. It's their purpose. Every other Primaris chapter was rolled out with great fanfare, paraded as the Emperor's gift to a dying Imperium. But the spears? They were dumped into the Veil with little ceremony, no support structure, and no apparent backup. It's as if someone wanted them to either prove they could survive without the Imperium or die and never be remembered. And the crazy part? They did survive. Not just survive, they thrived in their own grim way. They didn't wait for orders, they didn't cry out to Terra. They adapted, turned the nightmare around them into home. That kind of tenacity doesn't come from protocol. It comes from something older, something primal, something that goes beyond any Codex Astartes. And then there's the whole idea of who led them. The name Amadeus Duquesne crops up, a legend among them. Not a chapter master in the traditional sense, but something wilder. A warrior priest, a mythic figure, half savage and half saint. He's not Guilliman, and he's definitely not Dorn, but to the spears, he's the Emperor's voice. The man who taught them that survival is a sacred duty. That loyalty isn't about oaths, but about action. That the Emperor's will isn't heard in councils, but in the screams of dying worlds. Some say he might even be more than just a man. That perhaps Duquesne is one of Kahl's deeper experiments, a post-human relic built not just to lead, but to embody a forgotten ideology. Whatever the truth, he's the reason the spears believe they're not just another tool of the Imperium, they're its shield, even if the Imperium itself has turned its back on them. That sense of abandonment defines their early years. No reinforcements, no supplies, no fleet support. They had to scavenge, adapt, even barter with rogue Mechanicus elements just to keep fighting. And yet, instead of becoming pirates or mercenaries, they doubled down on their mission. Protect the people, hold the line, kill what comes. Their refusal to break, even in the face of cosmic indifference, became their creed. They don't pray in cathedrals. They don't chant litanies to Mars. They sharpen their blades and whisper their oaths to the storm itself. In a way, their very origin is an act of resistance, against neglect, against bureaucratic rot, against the idea that only those with medals and parchments are worthy of being remembered. The Emperor's spears were born not to be admired, but to endure. Not to be catalogued, but to be feared by those who threaten humanity. And maybe that's why they were forgotten. Because they didn't play the game. They didn't ask for glory. They just kept fighting, no matter what. And that's a kind of loyalty even the Imperium isn't ready to face. Nemeton isn't just a homeworld, it's a sentence, a punishment masquerading as duty. The kind of place you send warriors not because you trust them, but because you want them gone. When you look at where the Emperor's spears were stationed, you start to understand just how intentionally they were cut off from the Imperium. Alara's Veil isn't simply remote, it's practically beyond reach. An entire region of void space choked by warp storms, unreliable routes, and dead systems. Even by the Imperium's brutal standards of isolation, this is exile taken to the extreme. Nemeton sits like a jagged tooth in the heart of that storm, a place where light barely penetrates and help never comes. It's the kind of world that doesn't just test your strength, it warps your soul. The very geography of Nemeton shaped who the spears became. The planet is battered by constant electrical storms that never truly end. The oceans are deep and violent, filled with things that have no names in Low Gothic. The land is broken, and the sky feels like it's always about to collapse on you. But what's strangest is the silence. Not literal silence, storms rage and beasts howl, but the kind of silence that comes from being forgotten. There are no astropathic beacons here. No constant litany of Imperial dogma. The chapter fortress, if you can even call it that, is carved into cliffs, drenched in salt spray, surrounded by the bones of leviathans. And when you live like that, with only your brothers and the sea as company, your identity mutates. You don't think in terms of crusades and high lords, you think in terms of survival, of tide and steel. It's no wonder their culture diverged so much from the standard Imperial script. When you live cut off from Terra, from Mars, From any reliable contact with the rest of the Imperium, you stop acting like a cog in a machine and start becoming something feral. The spears didn't just adapt, they evolved into something else entirely. Their rituals, their language, even the way they fight, it's all soaked in the primal essence of Nemeton. They don't revere the Emperor with prayers and incense. They see him as a force of nature, a storm to be respected, feared, and obeyed, not worshipped. And maybe that's what really sets them apart. They're not pious, they're elemental. Some fans even speculate that their psychic isolation has had effects we don't fully understand. That maybe, over the centuries, their connection to the warp dulled or shifted. That perhaps the constant pressure of the veil around them has warped their perceptions, made them see things differently, more instinctively. And if that's true, then it's not just distance that makes them strange, it's metaphysical drift. They've become something other than what Call designed. Maybe even something Call wouldn't recognize anymore. You can see this disconnection most clearly in how little political influence they hold. Unlike chapters like the Ultramarines or the Black Templars, who have representatives, influence, and recorded exploits across half the galaxy, the Spears are barely mentioned. Not because they haven't fought. By all accounts, they've been locked in endless battles against horrors in the dark for centuries, but because no one writes those battles down. There are no scribes chronicling their victories, no diplomats lobbying for resources. They don't send emissaries to Terra. They don't appear in grand strategy meetings. They're ghosts, and ghosts don't get a vote. This absence from the political stage is both curse and blessing. On one hand, it means they're cut off from vital reinforcements, technological support, and strategic insight. On the other, it means they're free to act as they see fit, unshackled by the demands of the ecclesiarchy or the Inquisition. They answer to no one but their own code. And in a galaxy where most Space Marines are bound by thousands of layers of protocol and expectation, that kind of autonomy is practically heresy. But it's also power. It's tempting to wonder whether the isolation was deliberate from the start. Some fans argue that Guilliman, pragmatic as he was, recognized the need for a chapter that could operate without oversight. That the Spears were never meant to integrate. They were meant to endure, to be a failsafe and a part of the galaxy too wild for the Imperium's rigid hierarchy. Others believe it's more sinister. That the High Lords wanted to bury some of Call's more controversial genetic work, and the best way to do that was to post it in the middle of nowhere. Either way, the result is the same. A chapter that exists in the shadow of a civilization it no longer trusts. And trust is a big part of this. The Spears don't trust the Imperium. Not fully. How could they? The Imperium left them in the dark for generations. No supply lines, no reinforcement, no communication beyond what their astropaths could claw together in fits of agony. If the Imperium is a father to the Astartes, then the Spears were the children locked in the attic. And over time, that abandonment hardens. It becomes a scar, a philosophy. They don't fight for Terra. They fight for the people under their protection, the scattered human enclaves of Alara's Vale. The outposts no one else even remembers exist. They bleed for those forgotten millions, not because of doctrine, but because no one else will. That's what makes their story so haunting. It's not just a tale of isolation. It's a tale of a bond between warrior and world, between Astartes and the unspoken. Nemeton didn't just shape them, it absorbed them, turned them into something wild, something sharp, something unknowable. And when you realize that, you start to see them not as a chapter, but as a myth in motion. A storm given form. A memory the Imperium doesn't want to confront. And yet, they're still there. Still holding the line in silence. Not because they were ordered to, not because they expect thanks, but because someone has to. And if that's not loyalty in its purest, rawest form, I don't know what is. There's something deeply primal about the Emperor's Spears. You can feel it in every description of their rights, in the way they speak, in how they carry themselves in battle. These aren't the polished paladins of the Codex Astartes. They don't recite long litanies before engaging the enemy, nor do they bury themselves in ecclesiastical ritual. Their culture is older than that. Older, not in years, but in essence. It feels like a fragment of humanity's distant tribal past has survived in the farthest reach of space, clad in ceramite and armed with bolters. They refer to themselves as hunters, more than warriors. And that's not just poetic language, it's their identity. Each kill isn't simply a duty, it's part of a great cycle, a test of skill, endurance, and spiritual worth. They don't kill to serve the Imperium. They kill because the galaxy is full of predators, and someone must become a bigger predator to protect the pack. On Nemeton, where survival is never guaranteed, that mindset isn't an affectation. It's the foundation of who they are. Their belief system is laced with animistic undertones. They speak of spirits in the wind, voices in the waves, omens in the storm. It's not superstition, it's something closer to communion. They believe Nemeton is alive, that it breathes, hungers, watches, and when a battle is joined, they believe the world listens. They don't pray to the Emperor as a man on a throne. They invoke him as a storm god, a force of judgment and fury. To them, the Emperor is the ultimate hunter, one who stalks through eternity, unblinking, and demands the same from his sons. That outlook shapes everything. Their rites of passage are less about martial drills and more about survival trials. A neophyte might be sent into the deep ocean trenches with only a blade and told not to return until he brings back the head of something that was trying to eat him. And if he fails, he's forgotten. Not with scorn, but with silence. Because in their eyes, death is not failure. Death is a part of the cycle. What matters is how you meet it. They speak in quiet tones. Even their communications are sparse, laconic. Words are weighty among the spears. There's a kind of reverence for silence, as if wasting breath is something shameful. It's eerie, honestly. Imagine a squad of Primaris moving through the ruins of a city, not shouting orders, not barking prayers, just moving, watching, striking. Like predators in perfect sync, that silence unsettles enemies. But it's not just tactical, it's cultural. They believe the Emperor hears action more clearly than words. A clean kill is worth more than 1,000 sermons. Their brotherhood isn't built on hierarchy, but shared ordeal. Rank exists, but it's almost ceremonial. What matters is what you've survived, what you've hunted, how you've protected the Veil. A veteran who held the line alone against a Xeno incursion might be revered more than a formal commander who spent years in fortress planning halls. This doesn't mean they're anarchic. It means respect is earned in blood and storm, not in titles. Leadership flows like water among them, shifting with the moment, the need, the threat. They adorn their armor with trophies, but not the kind you'd expect. Not skulls or purity seals. You'll see shark teeth, carved bone charms, sometimes even seaweed wrapped and sealed into a pauldron. It looks strange until you realize what it means. Each piece tells a story. A battle fought in a certain tide, a comrade lost to the abyss, a vow whispered over a fire during the long watches of the night. They don't wear these to intimidate, they wear them to remember. And then there's the way they view their duty. It's not obligation, it's instinct. The Imperium sees threats in terms of conquest and defense lines. The spears see them as prey or predator. A Tyranid hive isn't an invader, it's a rival pack. Chaos cults aren't enemies, they're corrupted wolves to be put down before they infect the rest. That language might sound poetic, but it reflects a very specific psychology. They don't see themselves as defenders of civilization. They see themselves as guardians of a fragile ecosystem, one in which humanity is always one mistake away from being overrun. What's especially fascinating is how their worldview bleeds into their art and storytelling. Yes, they have art, not banners or stained glass relics, but oral traditions. Stories passed down in low voices around fires or over the bodies of fallen comrades. Myths of past hunts, warnings wrapped in parables, tales that sound like tribal sagas but hold layers of strategic wisdom. Some fans have tried to reconstruct fragments of these tales based on scraps of recovered records or second-hand reports. One recurring figure is something they call the First Spear, a ghostly hunter who walks the storms and tests the chapter's worth when they grow complacent. No one knows if he's a metaphor, a daemon, or just a legend. But to the Spears, he's real enough. It's worth mentioning that this entire culture clashes hard with the rest of the Imperium. To the ecclesiarchy, they're borderline heretical. Their lack of traditional worship, their refusal to conform to the high Gothic expectations, their animism, all of it reeks of deviation. And yet they don't care. They're not trying to be understood, they're trying to survive. They're trying to protect the innocent in a galaxy that's all too ready to forget them. In some ways, the Emperor's spears are a warning. A glimpse of what happens when Space Marines are cut off for too long, not just physically, but spiritually. They become something else, not less, just different. And maybe that difference is exactly what the Imperium needs more of. Because in the end, what matters isn't the words you recite or the symbols you bear. It's the spear in your hand, the enemy at the gate, and whether you step forward when no one else will. The spears do, every time. When it comes to the relationship between the Emperor's spears and the Imperium, the phrase "it's complicated" doesn't even begin to cover it. Most chapters, even the more wild and wayward ones like the Space Wolves or the Carcharodons, still maintain at least a thread of formal contact with the Adeptus Terra. They send tithe reports, answer summons, and occasionally get new recruits or supplies. But the Emperor's spears? It's like they vanished into the veil and only rarely send back a flickering echo. And that silence has bred suspicion, because in the eyes of the Imperium, especially its bloated bureaucratic core, silence is synonymous with defiance. Let's be clear, the spears didn't choose to be forgotten. They weren't rebels setting off to forge their own dominion. They were placed in Alara's veil, and then they were left there. Supply lines vanished, reinforcements never came. Communications degraded into static, and still they held on. The problem is, when you're cut off for too long in the Imperium, people don't remember your sacrifices. They start to question your loyalty. And if you don't show up at the right meetings, if your name isn't inked into the right parchment in the right vault under Terra's ever-watching gaze, you start to look less like a chapter and more like a rogue element. The Adeptus Administratum has an ugly habit of writing history in the margins. If something is inconvenient, it's redacted. If it doesn't fit the current narrative, it's set aside. That's what happened with the Emperor's spears. They're not officially declared renegades, but they're not celebrated either. There are entire segments of the Imperium that have never even heard their name. Others whisper of a chapter gone feral, of Primaris Marines who turned their backs on Terra's light and built their own savage empire in the dark. None of it is true, but in a galaxy held together by propaganda and fear, perception is everything. And the few times they have made contact with Imperial institutions, it never goes well. When representatives of the Ecclesiarchy arrived on Nemeton seeking to correct the chapter's worship practices, they were politely refused. When a Mechanicus envoy came demanding access to their relics and tech vaults, he was sent away, albeit alive. These actions weren't hostile. They were firm, resolute, and quiet, just like the spears themselves. But the Imperium doesn't like being told no, especially not by those they consider tools. There's an incident, half rumor, half documented, about an inquisitorial retinue that attempted to investigate the spears for doctrinal heresy. The official report simply says the ship never returned from the Veil. Some claim it was warp storms. Others believe the spears offered no assistance, allowing the vessel to vanish. A few even whisper that the Inquisitor and her entourage were found, much later, buried in the cliffs of Nemeton, their bones wrapped in seaweed and sealed with solemn honor. If that's true, it suggests something terrifying, that the spears won't be judged by outsiders. Not because they see themselves as above judgment, but because they don't recognize the authority of those who abandoned them. But calling them deserters is lazy, and it misses the point. They didn't run from the Imperium. They stayed exactly where they were sent, and they've been fighting ever since. What they deserted wasn't the cause. It was the empty rituals, the hollow bureaucracy, the endless hierarchy that values appearance over action. They didn't reject the Emperor. They rejected the layers of incompetence that speak in his name. In many ways, that makes them more loyal than the parade chapters gilded in gold and incense. There's also a deep current of mutual discomfort that runs both ways. The spears look at the Imperium and see rot, a crumbling corpse being puppeted by institutions that have long since lost their soul. They don't hate it, not exactly, but they no longer believe in it, not the way the Codex demands. They believe in duty, in protection, in survival. And if that puts them at odds with Terra's clerks and cardinals, so be it. This all contributes to a very real sense of isolation, not just physical but spiritual. The spears aren't connected to the Imperium in any meaningful way anymore. Their records are outdated, their litanies don't match, their rites don't align. If they were to show up at a great gathering of chapters, they'd be the strangers no one wants to speak to. The wolves at the edge of the firelight, watching with cold eyes, unwelcome and untrusted. And yet, the irony is brutal. Because in so many ways, they represent what Space Marines were originally meant to be. Autonomous, adaptive, loyal not to thrones or dogma, but to the survival of humanity. That's the part that hurts, because if the Imperium really cared about loyalty, it would have remembered them, supported them, honored them. Instead, it treats them like a mistake, an experiment too wild to contain, too proud to break, and too useful to destroy. Among fans, there's an ongoing debate about this dynamic. Some argue that the spears are what all Astartes should be, free of blind obedience, grounded in action. Others fear that this kind of isolation always leads to corruption, that without the guiding hand of the ecclesiarchy or the Inquisition, any chapter might fall. But so far the spears haven't fallen. They haven't turned to chaos. They haven't carved out a kingdom. They haven't demanded fealty or tribute. They've just kept fighting in the dark, where no one else will. And maybe that's the problem. Because if they can survive without Terra, what does that say about the Imperium? If warriors can remain pure without chanting the Creed Imperialis, then what purpose do the High Lords really serve? These are dangerous questions, questions the Imperium doesn't want to ask. So instead, it looks away, pretends they aren't there, labels them ghosts, whispers of desertion, of deviation, of danger. But we know better. We've seen the fragments. We've read the tales. The Emperor's spears aren't deserters. They're the consequences of an empire too large to love all its children. And in the end, they didn't walk away from the Imperium. The Imperium let them go. Watching the Emperor's spears in battle is like watching a natural disaster unfold. Silent, precise, merciless. They don't fight like other chapters. There's no theatrical charge, no thunderous recitation of litanies. There's no honor guard proclaiming their arrival, no orbit-to-surface vox channels blaring with code-locked strategy. The spears arrive like a shifting current, quiet, coiled, lethal. And when they move, the only thing left behind is blood and silence. It's unnerving even for seasoned observers of Astartes warfare. Because while other chapters emulate ancient legions or knightly orders, the spears fight like apex predators. The first thing that stands out is how decentralized they are. Most codex-adherent chapters operate under strict formations, chain of command, and prescribed tactical doctrines. The spears seem to throw all of that out the airlock. That doesn't mean they're chaotic. On the contrary, their battlefield cohesion is uncanny. It's just that they don't rely on orders in the traditional sense. Each warrior is trained to read the terrain, the flow of combat, the position of his kin. Orders when they come are gestures, glances, or single-word commands. They hunt in unison, but they don't march. They stalk. A lot of fans have picked up on this and compared them to packs of wolves, but I think that sells them short. Wolves still need a pack leader. The spears operate more like shoals of razorfish, each marine reacting to the slightest shift in pressure, flowing and separating instinctively. It's beautiful and terrifying. A war form born not of doctrine, but of instinct, owned by centuries of surviving in isolation. And then there's the terrain. The spears are masters of unfavorable environments. They train for swamps, acidic rains, high-gravity zones, shadowed ruins, abyssal trenches, places where other Astartes would request orbital bombardment rather than go in. For the spears, those hostile spaces are home. They see every battlefield as a predatory landscape. Every collapsed structure is a hunting blind. Every toxic pool is a potential ambush point. They don't just operate in the environment, they become part of it. Their weapon choices also reflect this predatory mindset. They favor blades, especially long, curved ones reminiscent of sea hunter hooks, and close-quarters gear adapted for underwater or zero-visibility combat. Yes, they still use bolters, but there's a savage artistry in how they employ melee. A lot of other Primaris chapters use close combat as a last resort or glory charge. For the spears, it's where the real war begins. There's a brutal intimacy in it, and some whisper it's more than just efficiency, that it's spiritual, that they believe the Emperor watches most closely when your blade is in the enemy's flesh, when it's just you, your breath, and the moment of judgment. They also make liberal use of stealth. That's another thing that makes more rigid chapters raise an eyebrow. Space Marines aren't subtle by design. Their armor is loud, their presence overwhelming. But the Spears have adapted. Their movement is quiet. Their armor is modified with sound-dampening fabrics, mattified to reduce reflection, and sometimes daubed in local elements, mud, sand, even blood. Not because they're showy, but because it lets them move through death unseen. It's rare to hear a thunderclap of a jump pack among their ranks. What you hear instead is the slow hiss of a combat knife being drawn, the crunch of a broken ribcage under a boot, and then nothing at all. Some have even accused them of being cowards for how they avoid spectacle. But that's just ignorance talking. Because what the Spears do isn't cowardice. It's control. They don't fight for display. They fight to win. And every blow, every movement, every kill is measured with eerie restraint. That's what rattles other chapters the most. The Spears don't just kill, they cull. You won't find them in parade formations. You won't see them in honorific duels. But you will find them knee-deep in alien guts on a world no one's charted in 5 centuries. You'll find them waiting in a drowned corridor, weapons slick with condensation, eyes watching the darkness. And when the enemy thinks the battle is over, that's when the Spears move. Always last, always lethal. There's an infamous incident from an unnamed fringe world that stuck with me. A detachment of Spears was deployed to assist another Primaris force under siege by Genestealers. The other chapter arrived first, bold, loud, heroic, and charged in full Codex formation. They were nearly wiped out in 2 hours. The Spears arrived after the sun fell, without warning, without fanfare. They didn't communicate over open vox. They didn't join the formation. Instead, they bled into the terrain. Over 3 days, they hunted the Xenos down cell by cell, room by room, until nothing remained. By the end, the survivors from the original detachment weren't sure if they were watching allies or ghosts. That's the Spears in a nutshell. They don't come to save the day. They come to end the problem. And then there's the mental discipline. This isn't the mindless fury of berserkers or the serene detachment of ultramarines. This is something else. Controlled rage, a cold flame. Spears don't scream battle cries. They whisper oaths, not to glory, but to death. To the Emperor as hunter, to Nematon's storm. They fight not to be seen, not to be honored, but because no one else will. It's not that their way is superior. It's that it's theirs. Born of isolation, adapted for survival, perfected in silence. In a galaxy full of warriors obsessed with spectacle and tradition, the Spears are the embodiment of pure function. They are the last breath before the predator strikes. The shadow behind the flame, the quiet death in the dark. And in the end, isn't that what the Emperor always wanted? A blade that strikes not for pride, but for necessity. A spear cast so far it forgets the hand that threw it, yet still lands exactly where it's needed. Out in the Vale, there's no front line, no secure borders, no high command sending orders from the safety of Terra. There's only the silence of deep space, the howl of warp storms, and the things that move in the dark between stars. The Emperor's Spears don't fight glorious campaigns with grand victories and banners raised over conquered worlds. What they fight is more insidious, more constant, and far more thankless. It's a war with no end, no recognition, and no reinforcements. It's a silent war, one that has shaped them as much as Nematon itself. The threats they face aren't always the ones that make headlines across Segmentum broadcasts. These aren't massive hive fleets or full-scale chaos crusades. No, the horrors in Alara's Vale are quieter, older, and more deeply rooted in the cracks of the galaxy. Things that slip past the gaze of the Ordo Xenos. Cults that worship what they barely understand. Creatures that drift through the black, mindless and hungry, seeking out signals like a moth seeks flame. The Spears are the only ones left to stop them, and they do so without fanfare, just sharp steel and colder resolve. The Xenos' threats alone are enough to break most human worlds. Fragmented Tyranid bioships that splintered off from Leviathan, still pulsing with residual hunger. Eldar corsairs running wild in a region forgotten by diplomatic channels. And worse, things unnamed, unclassified, unseen. There are records, incomplete and redacted, of entire outposts devoured in one night. No survivors, no witnesses, just silence, and then a signal beacon pulsing until it burns out. The Spears answer those beacons, Always. They arrive after the blood has dried, moving through ruins not to save, but to stop the spread. And then there's the warp. Alara's veil sits on the bleeding edge of reality. It's not just a metaphorical phrase, it's literally cracked open. The storms that pulse through this region aren't mere weather. They're expressions of something deeper. Warp tides that twist time, space, even memory. Ships vanish mid-jump and arrive decades later, filled with corpses. Vox transmissions arrive out of sequence, repeating words never spoken. And in the middle of that chaos, the spears remain. Their apothecaries and librarians, what few they have, are not cloistered scholars. They are battlefield surgeons and psychic sentries, watching not just the enemy, but their own minds for cracks. Because in this war, the enemy isn't just outside the walls, it's in the whispers you hear in your sleep. The echo of your own thoughts, reshaped into something alien. The spears train for this. They meditate in silence so profound it becomes armor. They walk the storm's edge because if they don't, no one else will. Some fans speculate that the veil has changed them, physically, psychically. That constant exposure to warp anomalies has hardened them in ways no one else understands. Not corrupted, not tainted, but something in between. Something elemental. There are even stories, probably apocryphal, of spears who can sense the approach of daemons before they fully manifest, or whose eyes shine in the dark like the beasts of Nematon's deeps. If true, it would mean they've become not just hunters, but guardians of a reality most of the Imperium refuses to even acknowledge. Their approach to defense is as brutal as it is efficient. They don't build grand bastions or rely on orbital fleets. They deploy like shadows, kill teams that live among the human settlements, constantly moving, constantly watching. Each squad becomes a bulwark, each marine a fortress. When a threat rises, they don't sound the alarm. They extinguish it before the alarm can even be raised. That's the terrifying beauty of their method. The people they protect often don't even know they were in danger. The spears strike fast, bleed the threat dry, and vanish. It's not about heroism. It's about continuity. About making sure life in the Veil goes on. But that comes at a price. Constant exposure to unrelenting threat wears down even the strongest. There are whispers of battle brothers who never speak again after certain deployments. Of kill teams that go dark not because they were slain, but because they chose to remain in the wild, continuing their hunt without orders. The chapter accepts these losses without judgment. Among the spears, madness and martyrdom are twin siblings. Some must be sacrificed so the rest may endure, and they do endure. The spears defend Nematon and its surrounding systems like a wounded animal guarding its last den. They patrol void lanes too unstable for civilian traffic. They destroy cults before their gods even awaken. They sink Xenos infestations with surgical strikes so precise that by the time Imperial records catch wind of an anomaly, the problem is already ash. They fight 100 wars in 100 nameless places, and they do it without a single headline in the halls of Terra. That's the thing. No one thanks them. There are no medals, no saints, no statues, just the kill tally etched into armor and the memory of comrades lost in the shadows. And yet they keep going. Because someone has to. Because the Veil is bleeding and forgotten and full of things that should not exist. And because the people who live there, those countless billions clinging to life in the dark, have no one else. Some fans call them doomed. Others see them as romantic, tragic figures, holding the line alone. But I think the truth is more complex. They aren't tragic because they suffer. They're tragic because they've accepted the suffering as the price of duty. Because they no longer expect rescue, no longer believe anyone is coming, and still they sharpen their blades. Still, they patrol the silence. This is the war they fight, not for glory, not for politics, for survival, for the chance that just maybe the stars will still burn tomorrow. And maybe that's the purest war of all. There's something about the name Emperor's Spears that feels different. Most chapters are named after animals, weapons, or virtues. You've got the Iron Hands, the White Scars, the Blood Angels, names that evoke something symbolic, something tactical, something operatic. But the spears? That's a metaphor with weight. It's not a sword or a hammer. It's a thrown weapon, a tool of reach, precision, and sacrifice. You don't wield a spear in hand-to-hand combat. You cast it, knowing it may never return. And that's the myth at the heart of this chapter. that they were cast by the Emperor himself, flung into the void like a final weapon, meant to strike deep and be forgotten. Some say that's just poetic nonsense. But if you've read the scraps, pieced together the half-buried tales of Nemeton, you start to see the shape of something bigger. The spears don't talk about their name the way other chapters recite theirs. They live it. It's in their sigil, their silence, their acceptance of isolation. They believe they were made to die far from home, and that their death, if it comes, is part of something greater than they can ever understand. That's what makes them different, not just genetically, spiritually. They see themselves as the last gesture of a god who no longer speaks. That belief bleeds into everything they do. You won't find sermons about the Golden Throne among the spears. They speak of the Emperor as a presence in the storm, a figure not of rule, but of judgment. They don't pray to him so much as they walk alongside the echo of his will. Some even believe that the storm-racked nature of Nemeton is a reflection of the Emperor's own thoughts, violent, swirling, alive but unreachable. They don't see their isolation as abandonment. They see it as a trial, a crucible of relevance. If they are truly his spear, then their suffering is proof of purpose. And then there's the symbolism. Their heraldry isn't just aesthetic. The deep sea blue, the golden spear, the crest like a wave breaking, these aren't just war paint. They're totems, markers of identity carved out of myth. Each Marine knows the story of the first spear, the one cast before them, who never returned, who still flies somewhere in the dark. He's not a real person, probably. More likely a legend, a figure they project their purpose onto. But he matters. Because in a galaxy like this, sometimes you need to believe your pain has shape. This mythic framework has led to some fascinating fan theories. One of the most persistent is that the Emperor's spears aren't just forgotten, they're concealed. Hidden deliberately, like a buried blade, to be revealed only when all else fails. Some point to their unusual behavior, their isolation, even their deviation from standard codex structure, and ask, what if this was all part of the design? What if Robert Guilliman, or even the Emperor himself, authorized the creation of a weapon that would act independently of the Imperium's decay? It's a wild theory, but not without merit. The idea that a force could be trusted to function outside the influence of the Ecclesiarchy, the High Lords, even the Mechanicum. That's huge. It speaks to a level of contingency planning far beyond anything we usually attribute to Imperial leadership. And in a way, it makes sense. The Imperium is a colossus strangled by its own weight. Maybe the spears were meant to be the knife that operates in its blind spot? A scalpel in a world of clubs. Others take the theory even further. They whisper about the two lost legions, the 11th and the 2nd, the ones stricken from Imperial records, whose primarchs were erased from history. Some fans believe that the Emperor's spears are somehow connected to one of those legions. Not in blood, necessarily, but in spirit. That perhaps some fragment of genetic material or forgotten doctrine found its way into their creation. That Call, in his infinite ambition and cryptic logic, might have resurrected a thread that was never meant to be woven again. There's no proof, of course. There rarely is, but the idea persists. Because the spears feel ancient, even though they're technically young. They carry themselves like warriors who remember more than they should, like ghosts of something older. Their myths, their silence, their feral doctrine, all of it smells of something pre-heresy. Something before the rot set in. That's what makes them so compelling. They don't feel like part of the current Imperium. They feel like a memory of what it was supposed to be. And in that memory, the spear becomes more than a name, it becomes prophecy. A line drawn in blood and salt, pointing toward something we haven't seen yet. What if they were meant to outlive the Imperium? Not as rebels, but as remnants, as keepers of a different truth. That idea haunts a lot of us, because it means the story isn't over. That somewhere out there, among the black waves of Alara's Vale, the Emperors will still breathes. Not in the halls of Terra, not in the cathedrals of Mars, but in the blade of a forgotten chapter, still flying toward its target. And maybe that's the real terror for the rest of the Imperium. Not that the spears are lost, but that they were never meant to be found. Because if their myth is true, if they really are the Emperor's final weapon, then one day, they will land. One day the spear will strike, and whatever it hits won't see it coming. Loyalty in the Imperium is usually defined by proximity. Proximity to Terra, to the High Lords, to the rituals and chains of command that give meaning to obedience. A Space Marine salutes not just out of discipline, but because someone is watching, someone recording, someone judging. But what happens when that structure vanishes? When you're stationed on a dying world at the edge of known space, with no orders, no contact, no reinforcement, and, most importantly, no witnesses. Do you still salute the Emperor? Or do you start saluting survival instead? The Emperor's spears have been fighting in the dark for so long that the idea of Imperial structure has eroded into myth. Their chapter master doesn't sit on a throne surrounded by scribes. Their command structure isn't a neat hierarchy with rosters and commendations. It's tribal, instinctive. It moves like the tide. Leadership is determined by action, not appointment. In that kind of world, the question of loyalty becomes something deeper than protocol. It becomes existential. Are they loyal to the Emperor? Every motion of theirs says yes, but not in the way the ecclesiarchy would recognize. They don't chant the Creed Imperialis. They don't kneel before relics or wear rosaries made of bone. But they fight. They fight every day, with no expectation of reward. They die on forgotten worlds. They guard human outposts that have never heard of Terra, and they never ask why. Isn't that loyalty? Some would argue otherwise. In the absence of oversight, heresy breeds. In the absence of guidance, doctrine rots. That's what the Inquisition fears. That's why even the hint of deviation sends a black-robed kill team through the void. And yet the spears remain uncorrupted. Not because someone checks in on them, but because they choose to remain pure. They are loyal, not because of fear, but because of belief. A belief that the Emperor, even in silence, still watches. Not from a throne, but from the storm. From the edge of every battle, where death whispers. But let's be honest, it's a strange kind of loyalty. It's not fanatical. It's not mindless. It's something almost older than dogma. A tribal bond, a covenant written in blood, not ink. They don't obey because a superior told them to. They obey because they made an oath to the people they protect, and through that, to the Emperor's will. There's something raw and almost heretical in that, because what they're loyal to isn't the Imperium, it's humanity. The people, the weak, the forgotten. And to them, that's not a contradiction. That is the Emperor's will. But what happens when the Emperor's servants forget you? When the Imperium not only stops sending orders, but forgets your name? Do you owe them anything? That's the wound at the center of this chapter. They've been left out in the cold, written out of records, ignored by the Mechanicus, scorned by the ecclesiarchy. And still, they fight. Still, they answer beacons. Still, they bleed. Not because they believe in the administratum, but because they believe in what the Imperium once was, what it was meant to be, before it was devoured by rot. There's a story passed around among fans, possibly apocryphal, of a squad of spears who encountered an Imperial Navy vessel fleeing a chaos incursion. The Navy crew begged for escort, but when they learned who the spears were, they hesitated. The spears had no known heraldry in their archives, no active signal beacons. The commander whispered the word renegades. The spears still protected them, escorted the vessel across 3 sectors, slaughtered the pursuing warband. And then when it was over, they left without a word. That's the kind of loyalty that doesn't ask for recognition. That doesn't need it. Some theorists within the lore community go further, suggesting that the spear's broken chain of command isn't a flaw, it's a feature. That the Emperor or Guilliman, or maybe even Call himself, designed them this way. A chapter that could function outside the bureaucratic machine. One that could continue even when everything else collapsed. In that reading, their silence isn't abandonment, it's autonomy. A terrifying kind of freedom. Because what's more loyal, a soldier who fights when told, or one who fights when no one's watching? And yet, others fear the cost. Isolation has a gravity to it. It pulls everything inward. The longer a force is left to its own devices, the more it drifts. The question is no longer if the spears are loyal, but how long that loyalty can survive without validation, without connection. Can a chapter, however noble, sustain faith forever in a vacuum? So far, the answer seems to be yes. But the cracks are visible. Their rites grow stranger, their speech patterns evolve, their understanding of the Emperor shifts. They don't see him as a father or a king, They see him as a storm, beautiful, distant, and utterly indifferent. They obey him, but they no longer expect him to speak. And that kind of loyalty, it's no longer based on hope, it's based on endurance. In the end, the question of their loyalty isn't about oaths, it's about purpose. They believe their purpose has not changed, even if the Imperium has. And that might be the most chilling thing of all. Because they aren't waiting for the Imperium to remember them. They aren't looking to return. They are the blade thrown too far, forgotten by the hand that cast it, and yet still flying, still aimed, still faithful. When other Imperial forces encounter the Emperor's spears, it never goes as expected. For one, most don't even recognize them at first. Their heraldry doesn't match standard archives. Their ship transponders are often corrupted or blank. Their doctrines, their signals, even their speech, it's all different. Out there in the Veil, they've evolved in isolation, and the result is a chapter that feels more like a myth than a military asset. When they show up, it's usually to clean up a disaster others can't contain, and instead of thanks, they're met with unease. Because the truth is, the spears unsettle people. They don't fit. The Inquisition in particular has never known what to make of them. There are scattered records of interrogations, censored logs, half-redacted testimonies. Most notably, there's the case of Inquisitor Cordevelgen, who traveled into the Veil with the intention of conducting a purity audit on the chapter. What she found, or what she reported, was not heresy, but something stranger. She described warriors with immaculate gene seed records but completely divergent psychological profiles. She wrote about rituals that didn't violate doctrine outright, but skirted the very edge of accepted Imperial theology. And then her report stopped. Her last message was a single sentence. They are not ours, but they are his. No one has heard from her since. Some think the spears eliminated her quietly without malice. Others say she chose to remain, convinced of their value and necessity. Either way, the message she left behind says more than a dozen inquisitorial verdicts ever could. The spears don't break faith, they just don't play by the rules anymore. And that's dangerous to an organization like the Inquisition, which survives by cataloging threats, by fitting everything into a binary, loyal or heretic. The spears are a third thing, and that third thing terrifies people. Their interactions with the Adeptus Mechanicus haven't been much better. Forge worlds expect tribute, servitude, ritual acknowledgement. The spears provide none of these. They salvage, modify, and repurpose technology with a ruthlessness that borders on sacrilege. Their tech marines don't intone the canticles properly. They don't wait for approval to upgrade or repair. They use scavenged parts, repurposed Xenos alloys, even organic elements when needed. And worst of all, they make it work. There's a theory among some Mechanicus sects that the spears might possess knowledge Thufkal never intended to leave Mars. That they have fragments of experimental weaponry, lost blueprints, or data caches tied to suppressed Primaris projects. If true, that would explain the veiled hostility from the priesthood. A forgotten chapter that holds pieces of the machine god's forbidden gospel is a threat, not because it's wrong, but because it's uncontrolled. And the Omnissiah abhors what it cannot quantify. Even their dealings with other Astartes are strained. Chapters expect kinship, a shared understanding born from the gene-forged brotherhood of the Adeptus Astartes. But the spears don't bond easily. They don't speak the same symbolic language. They don't answer to the same banners. For them, every brother outside the Veil is a stranger, and every stranger is a potential threat. There was an incident not long ago, unconfirmed of course, where a company of Crimson Fists attempted to coordinate an operation with a detachment of spears. The spears arrived without announcement, refused centralized command, and conducted their own separate assault. The Crimson Fists were furious. Tactical integrity had been compromised, coordination lost, but when the dust settled, the spears had eliminated the target with surgical brutality, sustaining minimal losses. No medals were exchanged, no camaraderie was formed. They simply vanished, leaving behind silence and corpses. To some, this behavior is insubordination. To others, it's proof of function over form. A few chapters admire them, quietly. The Raptors, for example, known for their stealth-based tactics, are rumored to have shared field experience with the spears, and spoken of them with reluctant respect. Not affection, just a warrior's recognition of efficacy. But those instances are rare. More often, the spears are tolerated, sometimes investigated, and occasionally avoided entirely. There's something about them that makes even hardened space marines uneasy. It's like talking to a cousin raised in a wilderness you've only seen in nightmares. Among fans, there's been debate for years about whether these interactions are sustainable. Can a chapter exist without trust from the wider Imperium? Can it remain pure without peer review, without communion, without shared purpose? Some argue that the spears are already halfway gone, that their methods, their silence, their refusal to integrate are signs of inevitable drift. Others claim the opposite, that their distance is what keeps them pure, that the further they are from the rotting heart of the Imperium, the closer they are to the Emperor's original vision. Either way, the misunderstandings continue. Every time the spears emerge, there are whispers. Whispers that they're a secret successor of one of the lost legions, that they're the product of a failed Primarch project, that they're not even fully human anymore. And while there's no proof for any of it, the fact that these theories persist says everything about how alien they've become in the eyes of the Imperium. But maybe that's the point. Maybe they were never meant to be understood. Maybe the Emperor's spear was never designed to be admired, welcomed, or even known. Maybe it was always meant to be a weapon flung into the void, silent, sharp, forgotten, only to return when the galaxy had lost the will to remember what loyalty really looks like. This is where the debates start to burn. Not about tactics or gene seed or historical accuracy, but about meaning, about identity, about the core contradiction of the Imperium of Man. Because when you look at the Emperor's spears long enough, when you really start to see how they live, fight, and think, one question refuses to go away. What if they're the only ones who are still loyal in the way that truly matters? It's a painful thing to consider, especially for fans who grew up worshipping the traditional imagery of the Imperium. Golden thrones, holy shrines, towering cathedrals, banners waving above oceans of pious soldiers. But the truth is, that version of the Imperium, the one born from the Emperor's original vision, has been dead for a long time. It's rotted into something else. A machine of self-worship, of unthinking dogma, of blind ritualism masking incompetence. It's not a beacon anymore. It's a cage. And inside that cage, loyalty has become less about protection and more about performance. So what happens when a chapter, like the Emperor's spears, refuses to perform? When they don't chant the right words, don't send the right reports, don't kneel in the right direction, the Imperium calls them suspect. But here's the twist. The spears still do what needs to be done. They still protect human life. They still purge threats. They still bleed for those who can't defend themselves. They just do it without ceremony, without applause, without waiting for permission. And that unsettles a lot of people, because if they can be loyal without all the pomp, then maybe the pomp was never necessary to begin with. There are fans who go even further. They argue that the spears are what the Emperor actually wanted Space Marines to become. Not icons, not demigods, not statues in armor, but tools. Precision weapons, protectors. They weren't supposed to be saints. They were supposed to be efficient. And the spears, stripped of ego, stripped of politics, embody that ideal more than any other chapter. They don't ask to be remembered. They just act. And if that's not loyalty, if that's not service, then what is? It leads to an uncomfortable question. If the spears are still doing the Emperor's work and the Imperium is too blind to see it, then who has truly strayed? Who is the traitor in that equation? The silent hunter who keeps the fire burning on a dying world, or the High Lord in a palace who forgets his own warriors exist? This is where the debates turn bitter. Some fans defend the Imperium's rigidity, claiming that even its flaws are part of a grand design, that its rituals, however corrupted, still channel the Emperor's will. They argue that deviation is the first step to heresy, that purity lies in unity, but others push back. They point to the hypocrisy, the waste, the rot. They say the Imperium demands loyalty but forgets to offer it in return, that it exiles those it should embrace, silences those it should honor. And they hold up the spears as proof that loyalty does not need to be witnessed to be real. There's a word that comes up a lot in these discussions: integrity. The spears have it. Not the kind forged by codes and catechisms, but the kind that grows in silence, in hardship, in the knowledge that no one is watching and that no one cares. They act not out of obligation, but out of belief. And not belief in a throne or a title, but in the idea that humanity is worth saving, even when it spits in your face. And yet, they never turn bitter. That's what astonishes me the most. The Spears don't hate the Imperium, not really. They don't curse it. They don't raise banners of rebellion. They just move on. They accept that it has forgotten them, that they are alone, and they carry on anyway. There's a kind of peace in that. A peace born not of comfort, but of clarity. They know who they are. They don't need the Imperium to validate them. They don't need parades. They need only the mission. It's no wonder some chapters see them with suspicion. To those who cling to ritual as identity, the Spears are dangerous. A mirror held up to a bloated structure, showing what purpose looks like when you strip away the superstition. And in that mirror, some see a future they fear. A future where Astartes don't need high lords or chaplains or pageantry. Just blades, oaths, and the will to keep humanity alive. There's even a line from a fan poem I read once. It stuck with me. The last loyalist is the one who never left, even when he was forgotten. That's the Spears. Not the brightest, not the loudest, not the most beloved, but still standing, still fighting, still watching over the people no one else sees. And in doing so, they expose the real betrayal. Not of them, but of those who let them slip into darkness without a second thought. So are they the last loyalists? I think they might be. Not because they shout the loudest, but because they're the ones who never stopped doing the work. Even when no one was left to say thank you, even when the chain of command broke, even when their name was erased from records, they stayed, they fought, they endured. And maybe, just maybe, that's what loyalty always was meant to be. There's something profoundly haunting about the Emperor's Spears. Not just in how they fight or how they live, but in what they force us to confront about the Imperium itself. In a setting like Warhammer 40k, where everything is exaggerated, where every moment is drenched in blood, fire, and righteous fury, it's easy to lose sight of the quieter truths, of what loyalty really means when you strip away the monuments, the creeds, and the endless noise. The Spears bring us back to that raw question, not with words, but with action, with silence, with sacrifice. They exist in the margins of Imperial history, in the gaps between data streams and the static hiss of failed voxcasts. And yet, they endure. Not because anyone commands them to, not because anyone praises them, but because they refuse to let go of the mission. A mission that's no longer framed by high Gothic scripture or imperial decree, but by a quiet, stubborn belief that humanity still deserves a protector, even out here. Especially out here. I think that's what unsettles people most about them. They're not what Space Marines are supposed to be anymore. They don't fit the modern image of the Imperium's heroes. They're not poster boys for recruitment drives. They don't light up the sky with drop pods and glory. They don't deliver sermons before battle. They show up. They kill what needs killing. They vanish. And in doing so, they strip everything back to its essence. No distractions, no grandeur. Just loyalty, worn thin but unbroken. And in that stripped-down existence, they reveal something uncomfortable. That the Imperium might have forgotten what loyalty actually looks like. That in its obsession with dogma and hierarchy, it lost the thread. The Spears never did. Even when their oaths were answered with silence, even when their requests for aid went unanswered, even when the galaxy began to forget their name, they stayed. That kind of loyalty doesn't need medals. It doesn't even need acknowledgement. It just needs a reason. And for the Spears, that reason has never changed. Protect the weak, kill the threats, die on your feet. Some fans have called them nihilistic. I disagree. They're not fighting because they expect to win. They're not even fighting because they think it'll matter. They're fighting because it's the only thing that's left to do. Because the void is coming, and someone has to stand at the edge and say, "Not yet." That's not hopelessness. That's defiance. That's strength. There's beauty in that. In their silence, their brutality, their refusal to become anything but exactly what they were made to be, even when no one remembers why. They're not angels, they're not machines. They're the Emperor's Spear, thrown into the dark, forgotten in mid-flight, but still moving forward. And when that spear lands, it won't be with a roar. It'll be with a whisper. a blade through the throat of something that thought it could feast on the Imperium's bones unchecked. We talk a lot in this fandom about forgotten heroes, lost legions, unsung victories. The Emperor's spears are all of that rolled into one. They're not the chapter you see at the center of the stage. They're the ones standing in the wings, holding the ceiling up while everyone else performs. And one day, when everything collapses, it won't be the loudest who survive. It'll be the ones who've always known how to live without applause. So if this story made you feel something, if it made you question what loyalty actually means in this universe of rust and ruin, then maybe that's the real power of the spears. Not just in what they do, but in how they remind us of what's been lost, and what might still be worth protecting. If you want more deep dives like this into the hidden corners of Warhammer lore, into the unsung heroes and the quiet tragedies, you know what to do. Hit subscribe, stay with us, because sometimes the real stories aren't the ones shouted from Terra. They're the ones whispered from the edge of the galaxy, waiting to be heard. And if you're here listening, then maybe you're part of that story too.